Generals need armies to burn down a nation. Dictators need secret police. But Henry Kissinger needed only a telephone. From the sterile silence of the West Wing, he unleashed firestorms that erased entire civilizations. He sat miles above the screams, far removed from the smell of burning flesh, adjusting the coordinates of death with the stroke of a fountain pen. He viewed the world as a broken machine, and he used human lives as the fuel to fix it. He assumed the role of the architect, reshaping the 20th century with a terrifying godlike detachment. Decades later, the smoke has cleared, the treaties are signed, but the silence of his victims remains deafening. The year was 1968, and the American nervous system had finally snapped. The nation was hallucinating with fever. Martin Luther King Jr. lay dead in Memphis. Robert Kennedy was gone in Los Angeles. The great cities of the industrial North were burning, choked by the smoke of riots and the tear gas of the National Guard. And across the ocean, in a small strip of jungle that most Americans could not find on a map, over 500,000 young men were fighting a war that seemed to have no end. Vietnam was a gaping wound in the American psyche, bleeding the treasury dry and poisoning the soul of the electorate. The president, Lyndon Baines Johnson, was a giant of a man reduced to a shadow, a political titan broken by the screaming in the streets. He had announced he would not seek re-election, possessing only one final wish, one desperate grasp at redemption before fading into history: peace. In Paris, the machinery of diplomacy was grinding slowly into motion. It was a fragile, delicate dance at the Hotel Majestic. The North Vietnamese, the South Vietnamese, and the American delegation sat in stiff, smoke-filled rooms, arguing over the shape of the table itself before they could even argue about the lives of the men dying in the mud. But by October 1968, a breakthrough was imminent. The Soviet Union was pressuring Hanoi. The United States was squeezing Saigon. The guns were poised to go silent. The phrase, "peace is at hand," was whispered with cautious optimism in the corridors of Washington. But there was a man watching from the periphery, a man who was not an elected official, who held no cabinet position, but who saw the chessboard more clearly than anyone else. Henry Kissinger was, at this moment, ostensibly a Harvard professor and a consultant to the Johnson administration. Kissinger cultivated an aura of intellect, hiding a predator's instinct. He was a Harvard professor with eyes fixed on the West Wing. He had access to the classified cables. He knew the secrets of the Paris delegation. He was trusted by the Democrats to provide intellectual counsel. But Kissinger had done the cold, hard calculus of ambition. He had looked at the polls, analyzed the fractured soul of the Democratic Party, and realized that his future did not lie with the peacemakers. It lay with the opposition. It lay with a man who had been resurrected from the political grave, Richard Nixon. Then Kissinger made his move. He initiated a channel that would sabotage his own government and prolong a war for 4 bloody years. He began a double game. By day, he provided counsel to the Johnson administration, listening to their strategies and reading their internal memos about the concessions the North Vietnamese were willing to make. By night, he was feeding that high-level intelligence directly to the Nixon campaign. He became the mole inside the peace tent, using a secret channel to speak with Nixon's foreign policy team, often from payphones or through intermediaries, to avoid the prying eyes of the Secret Service. The mechanism of this betrayal required a conduit, a figure who could operate in the shadows between Washington and Saigon. Enter Anna Chenot, the Dragon Lady, the widow of the famous Flying Tiger general, a fierce anti-communist, and a prominent Republican fundraiser. She became the instrument of Kissinger's maneuvering. Armed with the inside information provided by Kissinger, specifically that Johnson was about to announce a bombing halt and that a deal was days away, the Nixon campaign activated her. Her mission was to contact the South Vietnamese ambassador Bui Diem and deliver a message that would alter the course of the war. The message to President Nguyen Van Thieu in Saigon was simple, cryptic, and devastating. She told them to hold on. She told them that they were going to win, but only if they waited. The instruction was clear. Do not sign the peace treaty with Johnson. If you sign now, you get a weak deal from a desperate Democratic administration. But if you stall, if you sabotage the talks, if you help Nixon win the election, you will get a better deal. You will get a Republican deal. It was a violation of the Logan Act, a private citizen undermining the diplomatic negotiations of the United States government. In any other era, it would be called treason. The tactic worked with lethal efficiency. 3 days before the election, the turning point of history arrived. President Johnson went on national television to announce a complete halt to the bombing of North Vietnam. The American public held its breath. Peace was real. The political momentum swung violently toward the Democratic candidate, Hubert Humphrey, and then the rug was pulled out from under the world. On November 2nd, mere days before the vote, President Thieu of South Vietnam suddenly announced that his government would not attend the peace talks in Paris. He boycotted the negotiations. The talks collapsed into chaos. The peace surprise turned into a diplomatic disaster, and the American public was left confused and disillusioned. Inside the Oval Office, however, Lyndon Johnson was not confused. He knew exactly what had happened. The National Security Agency had intercepted the cables from the South Vietnamese embassy. The FBI had tapped Anna Chennault's phone. J. Edgar Hoover, the legendary and feared director of the FBI, had placed the transcripts directly on the president's desk. Johnson listened to the reports. He saw the betrayal in real time. He knew that Nixon's camp was telling Saigon to stall, effectively condemning American soldiers to keep dying so that a political candidate could secure an election victory. Johnson, in a fury, called it treason. He told Senator Everett Dirksen that it would rock the world if it were known that candidates were playing with the lives of men for political gain. Yet Johnson faced an impossible dilemma. To release the evidence, he would have to admit that the FBI was wiretapping an embassy and a prominent political figure. He risked causing a constitutional crisis that could shatter the fragile unity of a country already on the brink of civil war. He feared that exposing Nixon would tear America apart even more than the war itself had. And so Lyndon Johnson did the only thing he felt he could do. He stayed silent. He took the secret to his grave, letting the clock run out on his presidency. Richard Nixon won the election by less than 1% of the popular vote, a razor-thin margin that would almost certainly have been erased by a successful peace deal. The gamble had paid off. The betrayal had secured the throne, and Henry Kissinger was not left out in the cold. For his loyalty, or perhaps for his complicity, he was awarded the prize he had coveted for decades. He was appointed National Security Advisor. He moved from the halls of academia to the basement of the West Wing, bringing with him the knowledge that he and the new president were bound together by a crime. The war did not end in 1968. Because the peace talks were sabotaged, the conflict would drag on for 4 more bloody years. 21,000 more American names would be carved into black granite. Over 1 million more Vietnamese would perish in the fires that were stoked to keep a political campaign alive. This was the foundation of the Kissinger era. He entered the White House not as a peacemaker, but as a co-conspirator, bringing with him a philosophy that would define the next decade, that the ends always justify the means, and that the truth is merely a variable to be managed. This secret alliance forged in the dark created a unique psychological bond between the new president and his national security advisor. It was not a relationship built on trust, but on mutual suspicion and a shared paranoia. Nixon, the volatile, insecure leader who saw enemies in every shadow, and Kissinger, the intellectual egotist who flattered the king while mocking him in private. They were two drowning men clinging to the same raft, floating on a sea of secrets. They knew that to protect what they had done, they needed total control. They needed to control the press, the military, the State Department, and even their own staff. The atmosphere of the White House shifted immediately from political administration to fortress. The White House that Henry Kissinger entered in January 1969 was not merely a seat of government, it was a bunker. From the moment the administration took power, a psychological iron curtain descended around the Oval Office. The shared secret of the 1968 election sabotage had bound the president and his national security advisor together, not just as colleagues, but as accomplices. They were two men who looked out at the world and saw only threats, leaks, and enemies. This shared pathology would birth a governance style defined by a terrifying insularity, where the machinery of state was dismantled and reassembled to serve the whims of two men who trusted no one. Not the Congress, not the press, not the cabinet, and certainly not the American people. The relationship between Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger remains one of the most complex and toxic psychodramas in political history. It was a partnership of staggering brilliance and profound insecurity, a paranoid partnership that operated like a medieval court transferred to the nuclear age. Nixon was the brooding monarch, socially awkward, prone to dark, drunken rages, and consumed by perceived slights. He was a man who despised the Eastern elite, the Ivy League intellectuals, and the media, yet he craved their approval desperately. Kissinger was the court vizier, the man who understood the king's hunger better than anyone. He was the flatterer-in-chief, a man who would spend hours on the telephone soothing Nixon's ego, reinforcing his prejudices, and assuring him that he was a genius besieged by fools. The White House taping system, which would eventually destroy the presidency, captured the reality of this symbiosis. To Nixon's face, Kissinger was obsequious, constantly reinforcing the president's belief that he was a lone warrior standing against a tide of weakness. He would tell Nixon that the press was hysterical, that the anti-war protesters were traitors, and that only Nixon had the strength to pull the trigger. But the moment the door closed, the mask slipped. In private conversations with journalists and socialites at Georgetown dinner parties, Kissinger would roll his eyes and mock the very man he served. He called Nixon that madman, the drunk, and referred to the president's meatball mind. It was a duality that defined Kissinger's survival instinct. He made himself indispensable to the king while signaling to the world that he was the only rational adult in the room, the check on the president's worst impulses. But in truth, Kissinger did not check Nixon's impulses. He channeled them. He took Nixon's inarticulate rage and refined it into cold, hard policy. They shared a disdain for the bureaucracy. They viewed the State Department, with its thousands of career diplomats and ethical guidelines, as a sluggish beast that could not be trusted. Together, they orchestrated a quiet coup within the executive branch. William Rogers, the Secretary of State, was reduced to a humiliating figurehead, kept in the dark about major decisions, while the real power was consolidated in the basement of the West Wing in Kissinger's office. Foreign policy was no longer the consensus of a government. It was the private property of two men. This concentration of power required absolute secrecy, and secrecy bred paranoia. The catalyst for the descent into illegality came early in the administration. In 1969, Nixon ordered a secret bombing campaign against Cambodia, a neutral nation. When news of this illegal operation leaked to the New York Times, the reaction inside the White House was apoplectic. Nixon didn't care about the morality of bombing a neutral country. He cared that the secret had escaped the bunker. He demanded names. He demanded that the leaks be plugged by any means necessary. It was Henry Kissinger who operationalized this paranoia. In a move that foreshadowed the Watergate scandal and the eventual collapse of the administration, Kissinger ordered the FBI to wiretap his own staff. He provided the names of his closest aides, men like Morton Halperin, who had drafted his speeches and prepared his briefs, to J. Edgar Hoover. These were not suspected spies for a foreign power. They were American civil servants. Yet their phones were bugged. Their private conversations with their wives and children were recorded, transcribed, and placed in Kissinger's safe. The atmosphere inside the National Security Council became toxic. Staffers worked in a climate of fear, knowing that their boss was listening, knowing that a single misplaced word to a journalist could end their careers. Kissinger justified this as the necessary price of order. In his worldview, a superpower could not function if it was leaking information like a sieve. But the wiretaps revealed something darker about the man himself, a profound lack of moral boundaries when it came to the preservation of his own position. He was willing to violate the civil liberties of his own team to prove his loyalty to a president he privately held in contempt. This internal war was mirrored by an external strategy that was equally unhinged. Nixon and Kissinger developed the madman theory. The idea was to make the leaders of the Soviet Union and North Vietnam believe that Richard Nixon was volatile, irrational, and capable of anything, even nuclear war, if he was pushed too far. They wanted the world to fear the American president. Kissinger would quietly tell diplomats with a grave expression that he couldn't control Nixon, that the president was obsessed with communism and had his finger on the button. It was a high-stakes game of psychological poker, using the threat of global annihilation as a bargaining chip. But playing the madman requires one to occasionally do mad things. To make the threat credible, the violence had to be real. The abstraction of credibility became the altar upon which human lives were sacrificed. As the 1960s bled into the 1970s, this need to demonstrate toughness, to prove that the American giant was not tied down by the ropes of morality, would turn its gaze toward the innocent. The paranoia that began with wiretaps in Washington would soon manifest as high-explosive thunder over the rice paddies of Southeast Asia. The bunker mentality had taken hold, and the doors were locked from the inside. Now, they could do whatever they wanted. If the paranoid partnership was the psychological engine of the Nixon administration, the bombing of Cambodia was its first terrifying physical manifestation. By early 1969, the war in Vietnam had settled into a bloody, grinding stalemate. The American military machine, for all its technological superiority, was bogging down in the mud of the Mekong Delta and the highlands of the DMZ. Nixon, desperate to fulfill his campaign promise of peace with honor, felt caged. He needed to break the deadlock. He needed to show the North Vietnamese that the rules of the game had changed. He looked at the map of Southeast Asia, and his eyes settled on the long, jagged border shared with a neutral neighbor, the Kingdom of Cambodia. For years, the North Vietnamese army had used the dense, lawless jungles of eastern Cambodia as a sanctuary. They moved supplies down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, rested their troops, and stored their weapons just across the invisible line where American ground forces were forbidden to go. To the generals in the Pentagon, this was a source of immense frustration. But to Henry Kissinger, it was an opportunity. It was a chance to apply his theory of escalation in a laboratory setting, free from the prying eyes of the American press or the inconvenient oversight of the United States Congress. On March 18, 1969, a flight of B-52 Stratofortresses took off from Andersen Air Force Base in Guam. Their official flight plans stated they were heading for targets in South Vietnam. But as they approached the coastline, they received a new set of coordinates. Radar guidance systems locked onto patches of green canopy that lay inside the borders of a sovereign, neutral nation. The operation was codenamed Breakfast. It was the first course in a grim menu of destruction, followed by lunch, dinner, supper, snack, and dessert that would collectively be known as Operation Menu. When the bomb bay doors opened, they unleashed hell. A single B-52 payload can turn a box of jungle, typically 1 kilometer long and half a kilometer wide, into a moonscape. The trees are not just knocked down, they are splintered into toothpicks. The earth is churned into a cratered wasteland. The concussive force alone is enough to liquefy internal organs for anyone caught in the blast radius. On that first morning, and for thousands of mornings to follow, the United States rained high explosives on a country with which it was not at war. But the true horror of the Cambodian campaign was not just the bombing itself. It was the mechanism of deceit constructed to hide it. Henry Kissinger, the intellectual architect of this secret war, knew that bombing a neutral country was illegal. It violated the United Nations Charter, the U.S. Constitution, and the laws of war. To circumvent this, he helped devise a dual bookkeeping system that would have impressed a mafia accountant. The pilots flying these missions were briefed separately. After dropping their payloads on Cambodia, they would return to base and fill out false reports, stating they had struck targets in South Vietnam. These fake reports were fed into the Pentagon's official computers. The real reports, the ones that showed the true coordinates of the devastation, were burned or locked in top-secret safes. Kissinger and Colonel Alexander Haig personally oversaw the flow of this information, ensuring that the Secretary of the Air Force and the Congressional Oversight Committees saw only the lie. For 4 years, the United States government bombed a ghost target, erasing reality with paperwork. However, breakfast was not enough. The North Vietnamese were resilient. They dug deeper. Nixon's frustration mounted. In December 1970, the rage in the Oval Office reached a fever pitch. Nixon, furious at the lack of progress and possibly intoxicated, demanded a massive escalation. He wanted everything thrown at the problem. He picked up the telephone to call Kissinger. The transcript of the subsequent call between Henry Kissinger and his deputy, Alexander Haig, stands as one of the most chilling documents in the history of American foreign policy. It is the smoking gun of a war crime. Kissinger, relaying the president's furious and incoherent demands, translated them into a precise bureaucratic directive. He wants a massive bombing campaign in Cambodia, Kissinger told Haig. He doesn't want to hear anything about it. It's an order to be done. Anything that flies on anything that moves. Anything that flies on anything that moves. Let those words resonate. In the sterile language of military engagement, targets are usually carefully selected. Fuel depots, bridges, troop concentrations. Rules of engagement are designed, at least in theory, to distinguish between combatants and civilians. But Kissinger's order stripped away all distinction. It was a directive for total war. It authorized pilots to strafe peasant ox carts, to bomb rice farmers working in their paddies, to obliterate fishing boats on the Mekong. It was a command that viewed the entire landscape of Cambodia not as a country inhabited by human beings, but as a free fire zone. The result was an apocalypse from the air. Over the course of the campaign, the United States dropped more tonnage of explosives on Cambodia, a peasant society of farmers, than the Allies dropped on all of Japan during the World War II, including the atomic bombs. The landscape was physically altered. Ancient irrigation systems were destroyed. Villages that had stood for centuries were wiped off the map, leaving only craters filled with stagnant water and malaria. The human cost was catastrophic, but the political consequences were even more terrifying. Before the bombing, the Cambodian government was fragile but functional, led by Prince Sihanouk, who performed a delicate balancing act to keep his country out of the war. The American bombing destabilized this balance. The chaos weakened the central government and drove the terrified, radicalized peasantry into the jungles and into the arms of a fringe insurgent group that had until then been a negligible threat, the Khmer Rouge. Before the B-52s arrived, the Khmer Rouge was a ragtag band of Marxist fanatics hiding in the forests, numbering fewer than 5,000 men. They had no mass support, but the American bombs became their greatest recruiting sergeant. Every time a village was incinerated by the huge metal birds from the sky, the survivors, burning with grief and hatred, ran to the Khmer Rouge. Pol Pot, the shadowy leader of the insurgents, pointed to the sky and told the peasants that the city people, the people of Phnom Penh, the people supported by America, were trying to exterminate them. The menu bombings and the subsequent Freedom Deal campaign did not destroy the North Vietnamese sanctuaries. Instead, they acted as a hammer that shattered Cambodian society. They drove the North Vietnamese deeper into the country, spreading the conflict like a cancer. They created a power vacuum that allowed the most genocidal regime of the 20th century to rise from the ashes. Henry Kissinger often justified his actions by claiming he was saving American lives, buying time for withdrawal. He viewed Cambodia as a sideshow, a pawn to be sacrificed to protect the king in Vietnam. But to the people of Cambodia, it was the main event. It was the end of their world. The tragedy of Cambodia is the ultimate indictment of Kissinger's realpolitik. It demonstrated the horrific flaw in viewing the world purely as a chessboard. On a chessboard, pawns are removed and they simply cease to exist. In the real world, when you crush a nation from 30,000 feet, you do not create a void. You create a monster. The shadows of the B-52 wings were lengthening, stretching across the rice paddies, darker and colder than anyone could imagine, preparing the ground for the killing fields that were to come. By 1971, the grand illusions of the early war years had evaporated. The dream of a democratic, thriving South Vietnam that could stand as a bulwark against communism had been replaced by a grim mathematical reality in the mind of Henry Kissinger. The war was no longer about winning. It was about leaving. But for a superpower, leaving is never simple. You cannot simply pack up the helicopters and fly away, leaving your ally to be slaughtered without shattering your global credibility. The exit had to be choreographed. It had to be designed so that the inevitable collapse of South Vietnam would look like a failure of the Vietnamese themselves, not an abandonment by the United States. It was in the quiet, smoke-filled salons of Paris that Kissinger refined the most cynical doctrine of his career, the decent interval. The concept was chillingly simple. The United States would sign a peace deal with North Vietnam and withdraw its military forces. In exchange, Hanoi would return American prisoners of war. The unspoken underlining calculation was that South Vietnam was doomed. Kissinger knew that without American air power and ground troops, the regime in Saigon could not survive the hardened legions of the North, but the collapse could not happen immediately. If Saigon fell the day after the Americans left, the world would blame Washington. It would look like a surrender. However, if Saigon fell 18 months or 2 years later, the blame could be shifted. It could be framed as the incompetence of the South Vietnamese government. The goal, therefore, was not permanent peace. It was a pause, a decent interval between the American withdrawal and the communist victory, a timeline that would allow Richard Nixon to be reelected in 1972 and allow the United States to wash its blood-stained hands of the tragedy before the final curtain fell. The negotiations in Paris were a study in duality. While the official delegations met in the Hotel Majestic, engaging in public posturing and propaganda, the real work was done in secret villas on the outskirts of the city. There, Henry Kissinger met with Le Duc Tho, the stone-faced, iron-willed diplomat from North Vietnam. They were two masters of the game, trading maps and concessions while sipping tea. But there was a third party at the table, a ghost. The South Vietnamese government, the very people whose fate was being decided, were largely excluded from these secret talks. They were the product, not the partner. Throughout 1972, as the American election approached, Kissinger pushed harder. He needed a deal before the voters went to the polls. In October, he believed he had it. He emerged from a secret session with Le Duc Tho and famously declared to the waiting press corps in the White House briefing room, "Peace is at hand." It was a masterstroke of political theater. The stock market rallied. Nixon's poll numbers solidified. But in Saigon, the text of the agreement arrived like a death sentence. President Nguyen Van Thieu sat in the Independence Palace, reading the document that Kissinger had negotiated behind his back. His hands shook. He read the clauses, and he saw the betrayal written in black and white. The agreement called for a ceasefire in place. This meant that while the United States would withdraw its last remaining troops, the North Vietnamese army, historically estimated at over 150,000 soldiers who were already occupying territory in the South, would be allowed to stay. Thieu looked at Kissinger's envoy and famously wept with rage. "You are asking me to sign my own death warrant," he said. He understood what Kissinger refused to say publicly, that allowing a foreign army to remain on your soil while your primary ally leaves is not a peace treaty. It is a surrender in slow motion. Thieu refused to sign. He went on the radio denouncing the agreement, calling it a sellout. Kissinger was furious. The puppet was cutting his strings. Thieu's refusal threatened to derail the peace deal, and more importantly to Kissinger, embarrassed Nixon on the eve of the election. The National Security Advisor, the man of cool intellect, turned into a bully. He railed against Thieu in the Oval Office, calling him an obstacle to peace. But they couldn't simply remove him. They needed his signature to legitimize the process. To force Thieu's hand and to signal to the North Vietnamese that the U.S. was still dangerous, Nixon and Kissinger unleashed one final spasm of violence. In December 1972, after the election was safely won, they ordered Operation Linebacker II. It would become known to history as the Christmas bombings. For 11 days, the skies over Hanoi and Haiphong turned black with B-52s. It was the heaviest bombardment of the entire war. The U.S. Air Force dropped over 20,000 tons of explosives on the North Vietnamese capital. Civilians cowered in bunkers as their neighborhoods were pulverized. Hospitals were hit. Embassies were damaged. The world looked on in horror. The Pope condemned it. European allies were disgusted. Kissinger would later claim the bombing was necessary to force North Vietnam back to the table, but the historical record suggests a darker motive. The terms of the final agreement signed in January were almost identical to the ones agreed upon in October. The bombing didn't change the deal. Its true purpose was psychological. It was a message to Thieu. Look at what we can do. We will support you. We have the power. Now sign the paper. It was a bluff written in blood. Simultaneously, Kissinger began a campaign of coercion against his ally. He drafted letters for Nixon to sign, sent directly to President Thieu. The tone shifted from diplomatic to threatening. The message was blunt. Sign the accords, and we will continue to provide you with military aid and support. Refuse, and the United States will cut you off completely. You will be left alone to face the North. Thieu, cornered and isolated, had no choice. On January 27, 1973, the Paris Peace Accords were signed. Kissinger and Le Duc Tho shook hands. The Nobel Committee, in a decision that would become a permanent stain on the prize's legacy, awarded the Peace Prize to both anciens merci. Le Duc Tho, possessing a grim honesty about the reality of the situation, refused the prize, stating that peace had not yet been established. Kissinger accepted it. In America, the signing was hailed as the end of a nightmare. The POWs came home. The last combat troops boarded the planes. The television cameras turned away from Southeast Asia. But in Vietnam, the war did not end. The decent interval had merely begun to tick. The North Vietnamese used the ceasefire to rebuild their supply lines, paving the Ho Chi Minh Trail into a modern highway, moving tanks and artillery into position for the final blow. They knew the Americans were never coming back. They knew that the promise of full force support was a lie. Henry Kissinger had achieved his objective. He had extricated the United States from the quagmire. He had preserved the image of American power for the moment, but he had done so by mortgaging the lives of millions of South Vietnamese who had bet their existence on American promises. As the last helicopter lifted off from Da Nang, the silence that followed was not the silence of peace. It was the holding of breath before the execution. The architect of the deal turned his back and walked away, leaving the structure he had built to collapse under its own weight, exactly as he had calculated it would. If Vietnam was a tragedy born of cold calculation, the events that unfolded in South Asia in 1971 were a tragedy born of visceral personal hatred. It was here, in the humid delta of the Ganges, that the moral vacuum of the Nixon-Kissinger foreign policy was exposed in its most grotesque form. The world knows it as the birth of Bangladesh. But in the classified archives of the State Department, it is remembered as a moment when the United States stood shoulder to shoulder with mass murderers, fully aware of the slaughter, and chose to supply the bullets. The geography of the crisis was unique. Pakistan was a nation divided by 1,000 miles of hostile Indian territory. In the west lay the seat of power, the military, and the elite. In the east, what is now Bangladesh, lay the population, the jute fields, and the Bengalis, a people treated by their own government as second-class citizens, culturally and racially inferior. In 1970, the East voted for autonomy. The military dictator of Pakistan, General Yahya Khan, a man known for his heavy drinking and brutal authoritarianism, decided that the ballot box would not determine the future. The barrel of a gun would. On the night of March 25, 1971, the Pakistani army launched Operation Searchlight. It was a euphemism for extermination. The targets were not armed rebels. They were the intellectual and cultural pillars of Bengali society. Tanks rolled into the campus of Dhaka University. Soldiers moved from dorm room to dorm room, executing students and professors in their beds. They set fire to the Hindu neighborhoods, gunning down families as they fled the flames. It was a systematic attempt to decapitate a culture. Watching this horror unfold from the window of the U.S. consulate in Dhaka was a career diplomat named Archer Blood. He was a man of the old school, principled, observant, and deeply shaken by what he was witnessing. His staff went out into the streets and returned with stories of unparalleled savagery. Women raped in front of their children, intellectuals lined up and shot, the drainage ditches of the city clogging with bodies. Archer Blood did what a diplomat is trained to do. He reported the truth. He sent a series of frantic cables to Washington detailing the atrocities, but the response from the White House was silence. The silence was not due to ignorance, it was policy. Frustrated and horrified, Blood and 29 members of his staff signed a dissenting cable. It was sent via the low precedence rogue channel directly to the State Department. It was titled Selective Genocide. It remains one of the most blistering internal documents in the history of the U.S. Foreign Service. It accused the Nixon administration of moral bankruptcy. It explicitly stated, "Our government has failed to denounce the suppression of democracy. Our government has failed to denounce atrocities." They used the word genocide, a term that carries a legal obligation to intervene. Henry Kissinger read the Blood telegram. He did not see it as a call to conscience. He saw it as an act of insubordination. He scoffed at the bleeding hearts in the State Department. To Kissinger and Nixon, the lives of millions of Bengalis were irrelevant dust on the geopolitical scale. The reason for their callousness lay in Beijing. Kissinger was in the midst of orchestrating his greatest diplomatic coup, the secret opening to China. To get to China, he needed a bridge. That bridge was Pakistan. General Yahya Khan was the secret intermediary, passing messages between Washington and Beijing. Nixon and Kissinger were terrified that if they criticized Yahya for the slaughter in the East, he would shut down the channel to Mao Zedong. The grand strategy took precedence over the massacre. They needed the dictator, so they let him kill. But the tapes from the Oval Office reveal something even uglier than cold strategy. In private, the mask slipped. Kissinger called the Indians bastards and scavengers, prioritizing racial prejudice over human life. Nixon referred to Gandhi as an old witch. Kissinger, feeding the president's prejudices, called the Indians bastards and sons of bitches. In one particularly telling exchange, Kissinger dismissed the Indians as a scavenging people, implying that their suffering was of no consequence to civilized men. This racial animus blinded them to reality. As millions of refugees poured into India, creating a humanitarian catastrophe, Indira Gandhi prepared to intervene. Kissinger saw this not as a response to genocide, but as a Soviet-backed plot to destroy an American ally. He urged Nixon to tilt toward Pakistan. In a flagrant violation of U.S. law, which banned the transfer of military equipment to nations committing human rights abuses, Kissinger and Nixon secretly authorized the transfer of fighter jets from Jordan and Iran to Pakistan. They asked China to move troops to the Indian border to threaten Gandhi. They even deployed a U.S. aircraft carrier battle group, the USS Enterprise, into the Bay of Bengal, a nuclear threat aimed at India, the world's largest democracy, to protect a dictatorship that was actively slaughtering its own people. It was a moral nadir. The United States was essentially providing diplomatic cover for a genocide that would eventually claim an estimated 300,000 to 3 million lives and result in the systemic rape of hundreds of thousands of women. And what of the man who told the truth. Archer Blood was not commended for his courage. He was recalled to Washington. His career was effectively sidelined. Kissinger punished the messenger to protect the policy. When the dust settled, India had crushed the Pakistani army in a matter of weeks. Bangladesh was free. The tilt had failed. The United States had alienated India for a generation and stood on the wrong side of history. But in the halls of the White House, there was no remorse. The China trip went ahead. The champagne was poured in Beijing. The photos of Nixon shaking hands with Mao were flashed around the world, and the ghosts of the Bengali dead were swept under the rug, the collateral damage of a great man's vision of world order. While the jungles of Southeast Asia burned and the deltas of Bengal ran red with blood, Henry Kissinger turned his gaze to the Western Hemisphere. He looked south to the thin ribbon of land stretching along the spine of the Andes, Chile. Here, in the quiet, sophisticated capital of Santiago, a different kind of threat had emerged. It was not a threat of nuclear missiles or invading armies. It was the threat of an idea. In 1970, the people of Chile went to the polls in a free and fair election. They chose Salvador Allende, a physician and a socialist, to be their president. It was a historic moment, the first Marxist head of state in the world to be elected democratically. Allende was not a revolutionary firebrand in the mold of Fidel Castro. He was a man of the Constitution, believing in a peaceful road to social justice. But to Henry Kissinger, this distinction was irrelevant. In fact, it made Allende even more dangerous. Kissinger feared the contagion effect. If a socialist could be elected democratically and govern successfully in South America, it would send a message that there was a viable alternative to American capitalism. It would validate the very ideology the United States was fighting a global war to destroy. The super diplomat could not allow this experiment to succeed. His rationale for intervention was breathtaking in its arrogance and its contempt for the very democracy he claimed to defend. In a meeting of the 40 Committee, the secret group that oversaw covert operations, Kissinger delivered one of the most infamous lines of his career. Staring at the intelligence reports from Santiago, he declared, "I don't see why we need to stand by and watch a country go communist due to the irresponsibility of its people." With that sentence, Henry Kissinger acted as judge, jury, and executioner of Chilean sovereignty. To him, the Chilean voters were like wayward children who had chosen the wrong father, and it was the duty of the United States to correct them, by force, if necessary. The order came down from the Oval Office, fueled by Nixon's rage and Kissinger's cold calculus. The instruction to the CIA was explicit: make the economy scream. This was not a war of soldiers. It was a war of strangulation. Kissinger orchestrated an invisible blockade. The United States cut off aid, blocked loans from the World Bank, and financed strikes by truckers and trade unions to cripple the country's infrastructure. The goal was to create chaos, to make the daily life of the average Chilean so unbearable that they would beg for a change of regime. They were turning the screws on a civilian population to provoke a crisis, but economic warfare was too slow. They needed a spark to ignite the powder keg. The obstacle to a military coup was the commander-in-chief of the Chilean army, General René Schneider. Schneider was a constitutionalist, a soldier who believed that the military should never interfere in politics. As long as he stood at the head of the army, there would be no coup. So he had to be removed. Under Kissinger's supervision, the CIA funneled weapons and cash to a group of right-wing extremists in the Chilean military. The plan was to kidnap General Schneider, creating a pretext for a military takeover, but the operation was botched. On October 22, 1970, The kidnappers intercepted Schneider's car in Santiago. When he resisted, they shot him. He died on the operating table. The fingerprints of the White House were not on the gun, but they were all over the plot. Kissinger had wound the clockwork that led to the murder of a man whose only crime was his loyalty to the Constitution. For 3 years, the pressure mounted. The economy screamed. The society fractured. And then the hammer fell. On the morning of September 11, 1973, the residents of Santiago woke to the sound of jets screaming over the city. Hawker Hunter aircraft, supplied by the West, dived on the presidential palace La Moneda. Rockets slammed into the neoclassic building. Smoke billowed into the Andean sky. Inside, Salvador Allende, wearing a helmet and carrying an AK-47 given to him by Castro, gave his final radio address to his people. He refused to surrender. By the afternoon, the democratically elected president was dead. From the ashes of Chilean democracy rose General Augusto Pinochet. He was a man who wore dark glasses to hide his eyes and ruled with an iron fist. The Stadium of Santiago, once a place of sport, was turned into a concentration camp. Thousands of students, union leaders, and intellectuals were heralded into the stands. They were tortured in the locker rooms. The folk singer Victor Jara had his hands smashed with rifle butts before he was shot, his body dumped in the street as a warning. In Washington, the reaction was not horror, it was relief. The problem had been solved. Henry Kissinger's support for the new dictatorship was absolute. When reports of mass torture and disappearances began to surface, Kissinger dismissed them as communist propaganda. In 1976, he traveled to Santiago to meet Pinochet face to face. By then, the world knew about the caravan of death, about the women raped with electric prods, about the bodies dropped into the ocean. But Kissinger did not scold the dictator. Instead, the declassified transcripts of their meeting reveal a sickening camaraderie. Kissinger told Pinochet, "My evaluation is that you are a victim of all left-wing groups around the world, and that your greatest sin was that you overthrew a government which was going communist." He went further. He reassured the tyrant, "We want to help you, not undermine you. You did a great service to the West in overthrowing Allende." A great service. That was the epitaph Henry Kissinger offered for the death of Chilean democracy. He had turned a country into a laboratory for authoritarianism, proving that in his version of the world order, human rights were always negotiable, and liberty was a privilege granted only to those who voted the right way. The ghost of Salvador Allende would haunt Latin America for decades, but in the halls of Washington, the file was closed. The irresponsible people had been corrected. On August 9, 1974, the most powerful man in the world walked across the south lawn of the White House, climbed into a helicopter, and vanished into political exile. Richard Nixon, the architect of the paranoid partnership, was gone, consumed by the cancer of Watergate. But the other half of the partnership remained. As the helicopter rotors chopped the humid air, Henry Kissinger stood on the lawn, watching his patron depart. He was not finished. In fact, he was just beginning his ascent to the absolute zenith of his power. The new president, Gerald Ford, was a decent man, a former football player from Michigan, a creature of the House of Representatives, honest, open, and hopelessly out of his depth in the shark tank of international diplomacy. He had no experience in foreign affairs. He looked at the map of the world and saw a blur of confusion. He needed a guide. He needed a regent. Henry Kissinger stepped into the vacuum. For the next 2.5 years, he was not merely the Secretary of State. He was the de facto president for foreign policy. He held the dual hat, serving as both National Security Advisor and Secretary of State, a concentration of authority never seen before or since in American history. In the Ford White House, Kissinger walked with the swagger of an emperor. He no longer had to manage Nixon's neuroses or flatter a paranoid king. He was the king. And in this era of unchecked authority, he would authorize two of the most cynical betrayals in the long, dark history of the Cold War. The first took place on the edge of the Pacific, in the tropical heat of Jakarta. The year was 1975. The Portuguese Empire was collapsing, and its colonies were drifting loose. One of these was a small half-island north of Australia, East Timor. The Timorese people, after centuries of colonial rule, had declared independence. They were poor, they were Catholic, and their leading political party, Fretilin, had leftist leanings. To the average observer, they were a tiny nation trying to find its footing. To the dictator of neighboring Indonesia, General Suharto, they were a meal waiting to be devoured. Suharto wanted to annex East Timor. But Indonesia was a client state of America, its military armed almost exclusively with U.S. weapons. By U.S. law, these weapons could only be used for self-defense. An invasion of a neighbor was illegal. Suharto needed permission. He needed the blessing of the puppet master. On December 6, 1975, President Ford and Henry Kissinger arrived in Jakarta for a state visit. The transcripts of their meeting with Suharto are a study in complicity. Suharto, nervous and deferential, asked for understanding regarding his plan to take rapid or drastic action against East Timor. Ford, unsure of the script, turned to Kissinger. It was Kissinger who took the lead. He did not warn Suharto about international law. He did not speak of the right to self-determination. He was concerned only with the optics. "We would understand your problem and the need to move quickly," Kissinger told the dictator, "but it is better that it be done after we return." He was worried about the embarrassment of an invasion happening while the American president was physically present in the Indonesian capital. It was a scheduling conflict, not a moral objection. Then he delivered the line that sealed the fate of a nation. "It is important that whatever you do succeeds quickly." The green light was lit. The next morning, Ford and Kissinger boarded Air Force One. As the wheels of their jet retracted into the fuselage, the wheels of the Indonesian transport planes were touching down in Dili. Paratroopers filled the sky. Warships shelled the harbor. The slaughter that followed was of biblical proportions. The Indonesian army, using American M16 rifles and American helicopters, conducted a scorched earth campaign. They bombed villages into dust. They herded civilians into camps where starvation was used as a weapon. Over the next 2 decades, an estimated 200,000 Timorese, 1/3 of the entire population, would perish. In terms of percentage of population killed, it was one of the worst genocides since the Holocaust. Back in Washington, the State Department bureaucracy tried to halt arms shipments, citing the illegal use of weapons. Kissinger was furious. He raged at his staff for interfering. "I know what the law is," he shouted in a meeting, "but I am also trying to keep Indonesia from flipping to the Soviets." He ordered the arms flow to continue. He ensured that the ammunition used to execute Timorese priests and children kept arriving on schedule. While the blood was drying in East Timor, Kissinger was orchestrating another betrayal in the mountains of the Middle East. For years, the United States, at the behest of the Shah of Iran, had encouraged the Kurdish people of Iraq to revolt against Saddam Hussein. The Kurds, a stateless people accustomed to being used as pawns, believed the American promises. They believed that if they fought, the United States would have their backs. Kissinger funneled millions of dollars in weapons to the Kurdish fighters, the Peshmerga. They bled Saddam's army, tying down the Iraqi divisions, acting as the perfect proxy force. But to Kissinger, the Kurds were not allies. They were a lever. Their purpose was not to win their freedom, but to annoy Saddam Hussein enough to force him to make a deal with the Shah. In March 1975, the lever had served its purpose. The Shah and Saddam met in Algiers and signed a peace treaty. The border dispute was settled. Overnight, the Kurds became expendable. The Shah closed the border, cutting off the supply of food and ammunition. The Kurds were stunned. They sent desperate cables to the CIA, to the State Department, to Kissinger personally. "Our people's fate is in unprecedented danger," the Kurdish leader Mustafa Barzani wrote. "Complete destruction is hanging over our head. We appeal to you and to the conscience of the world." The conscience of the world was silent. Kissinger did not answer the letters. He ordered the covert operation shut down immediately. Without American support, the Iraqi army moved in with vengeful fury. They used napalm and chemical weapons. Thousands of Kurds were slaughtered. Hundreds of thousands were driven into refugee camps. The rebellion was crushed. Later, when called to testify before a congressional committee about why he had abandoned a people who had fought and died for America, Kissinger did not apologize. He did not express regret. He simply shrugged and uttered a sentence that strips the veneer off the profession of diplomacy forever. Covert action should not be confused with missionary work. In the world of Henry Kissinger, there are no friends, only interests. The Timorese were sacrificed for a shipping lane. The Kurds were sacrificed for a border treaty. They were variables in an equation, and when the math changed, they were erased. The puppet master had pulled the strings, and the bodies fell where they may. If history has a sense of humor, it is a dark and twisted one. Nowhere is this more evident than in the events of October 1973. In Oslo, Norway, the Nobel Committee made an announcement that would forever shatter the moral authority of the prize. They awarded the Nobel Peace Prize jointly to Le Duc Tho of North Vietnam and Henry Kissinger of the United States. It was a moment of surreal, grotesque theater. The man who had sabotaged the peace talks in 1968, who had ordered the secret bombing of Cambodia, and who had just unleashed the Christmas bombings on Hanoi, was now crowned the Prince of Peace. The reaction was immediate. 2 members of the Nobel Committee resigned in protest, an unprecedented act in the history of the institution. The satirist Tom Lehrer famously declared that political satire became obsolete when Henry Kissinger was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. But the true measure of the man was revealed in the response of the recipients. Le Duc Tho, a man who had spent his life in the jungle fighting a war he believed was righteous, refused the award. He stated simply that peace had not yet been established, and he could not in good conscience accept a prize for a deal that was merely a ceasefire on paper. Henry Kissinger, however, accepted. He did not go to Oslo, perhaps fearing the protesters who would be waiting, but he took the medal. He took the honor. He took the validation. He wore the mantle of the peacemaker while the ink on the death warrants of South Vietnam was still wet. It was the ultimate act of diplomatic camouflage. The prize became a shield, a shiny golden deflection that he would use for the rest of his life to blind the world to the reality of his record. In 1977, when the Ford administration ended, Kissinger left government. But unlike most public servants who fade into quiet retirement, Kissinger transformed. He capitalized on his name. He founded Kissinger Associates, a secretive consulting firm in New York. He became the high priest of the global elite. For a hefty fee, he offered corporations and dictators access to his Rolodex. He advised banks, mining companies, and foreign governments. He monetized the secrets he had learned while on the public payroll. He became a celebrity, a fixture at black tie galas, charming the press, joking with talk show hosts, his deep voice rumbling with the authority of a sage. But as the decades wore on, the Teflon coating began to scratch. The Cold War ended. The Berlin Wall fell. And with the collapse of the old dictatorships, the archives began to open. In the 1990s and early 2000s, a new generation of researchers, journalists, and human rights lawyers began to dig. They found the documents in the archives of terror in Paraguay. They found the declassified cables in Washington. They found the memos detailing Operation Condor, the cross-border campaign of assassination and terror run by South American dictatorships. And on document after document, they found the fingerprints of Henry Kissinger. The super diplomat suddenly found his world shrinking. The man who had treated the globe as his personal chessboard was now being checkmated by the law. In 2001, the irony reached its peak. Kissinger was staying at the Ritz Hotel in Paris, the very city where he had negotiated his peace. He was there to be feted by the French elite, but instead of a fan, a knock came at the door. It was the French police. They were delivering a summons from Judge Sophie Hélène Chateau. She wanted to question him about the disappearance of 5 French citizens during the Pinochet regime in Chile. Kissinger did not answer the door. He did not go to the court. He fled. The former Secretary of State left the hotel surrounded by bodyguards, rushed to the airport, and left France. The elder statesman had become a fugitive from a subpoena. Similar scenes played out across the world. Judges in Argentina wanted to question him. A court in Spain sought his testimony. Lawyers in London prepared indictments. The man who had once flown across the world on Air Force One, welcomed by red carpets and military bands, now had to check with his legal team before booking a flight. He could not go to Brazil. He could not go to Chile. He could not go to Spain. He spent his final years in a gilded cage of his own making. In the salons of Manhattan and Washington, he was still revered, toasted by the powerful who admired his ruthlessness. But outside those walls, the ghosts were waiting. The children of the disappeared, the survivors of the bombing, the families of the tortured. They stood in the rain outside his speaking engagements, holding photos of the dead, chanting his name not in adulation, but in accusation. He remained defiant to the end. In interviews, when pressed about Cambodia or Chile, he would grow angry. He would dismiss the questions as naive. He would talk about the context, about the burden of office, about the necessity of tough choices. He never apologized. He never admitted fault. He died believing that he was the hero of the story. But the Nobel Prize sitting on his mantle could not silence the whispers of history. The irony was complete. The man who believed that order was more important than justice lived long enough to see justice begin to dismantle his order. The sage of diplomacy ended his days looking over his shoulder, haunted by the very chaos he had unleashed in the name of stability. Henry Kissinger lived to be 100 years old. He outlived Nixon. He outlived Ford. He outlived Mao Zedong and Le Duc Tho. He outlived the millions of anonymous men, women, and children whose lives were extinguished by the policies he drafted on yellow legal pads in the quiet of his office. To the very end, he remained a figure of immense polarizing gravity, a man who could command the attention of kings and presidents simply by clearing his throat. But as the coffin is lowered and the eulogies of the establishment fade, we are left to reckon with the bill. We are left to tally the invoice for the order he so cherished. Kissinger's defenders, and there are many, argue that he was a necessary monster. They argue that in the existential twilight struggle of the Cold War, the United States needed a man who was willing to dirty his hands. They claim that the opening of China, the détente with the Soviet Union, and the preservation of American hegemony required a suspension of ordinary morality. In this view, the bombing of a Cambodian village or the betrayal of a Kurdish rebel was not a crime, but a grim transactional cost, a pawn sacrificed to save the king. But the history we have walked through tells a different story. It tells the story of a man who did not merely tolerate the abyss, but who actively widened it. The tragedy of Henry Kissinger is not that he lacked intelligence, it is that he lacked imagination. He possessed a brilliant computational mind that could analyze the balance of power between empires, but he possessed a terrifying blindness to the human consequence of that balance. He viewed the world from 30,000 feet, where nations are just shapes on a map and people are invisible data points. From that height, you cannot smell the napalm. You cannot hear the screams in the torture chambers of Santiago. You cannot see the starving child in East Timor. This detachment was his greatest weapon, but it was also his fatal flaw. He separated the state from the human, believing that the interests of the former always justified the suffering of the latter. He built a foreign policy on the cynical belief that fear is a better adhesive than hope, and that a dictator who listens to Washington is always preferable to a Democrat who might not. And so we are left with the topography of scars. The craters in the Mekong Delta are filled with water now, green and silent, but the earth is still laced with unexploded ordnance that kills farmers to this day. The mass graves in Bangladesh and East Timor are covered with grass, but the generational trauma remains. The disappeared of Chile are still missing, voids in the hearts of families who never received a body to bury. These are not footnotes in a biography. They are the legacy. In the final analysis, Henry Kissinger was the ultimate avatar of the darker side of the 20th century. He proved that a man in a suit armed with a telephone and a fountain pen can be as lethal as an army. He taught us that the machinery of state, when stripped of conscience, becomes a voracious beast. He once famously joked that power is the ultimate aphrodisiac. It was a line meant to charm, to highlight his unlikely status as a celebrity. But in retrospect, it serves as a chilling epitaph. For Kissinger, power was not a tool to improve the human condition. It was the end in itself. It was the drug he craved, the lens through which he saw the world, and the altar upon which he sacrificed the innocent. Henry Kissinger is gone. The files are closed. But the question he leaves behind haunts us still. Is the order of the world worth the price of its soul? Or is a peace built on the silence of the dead no peace at all?